medication control program, and we had so many questions about it and some follow-up questions afterwards, we decided to do a second town hall webinar also on the ADMC program. On the 23rd of this month, we'll be at the 6-month mark since the launch of HISA's ADMC program. So we thought it was a good time to check in with you, share some recent amendments, and also answer questions. I know many of you have questions that are not related to the ADMC program. We ask that you hold those for now and share them with us for future topics, or of course, if you want to write to us, we'll write back to you and answer any questions. But for this webinar, we're going to focus only on the ADMC program. We're also very open to suggestions around future topics. So if you have ideas or you have things you'd like to see us cover in a similar format, in this town hall webinar format, please write to us at feedback@hisaus.org. We'll consider them and obviously look forward to holding future webinars like this, but on the different topics that you'd like to hear from us on. We're joined today by the leaders of the Horse Racing Integrity and Welfare Unit, or HIWU, the ADMC program's independent enforcement agency. HIWU is in charge, as you all know, of sample collection, results management, and investigations. They bring a tremendous level of expertise and professionalism to our equine anti-doping and medication control program. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ben Mosier, who's the executive director of HIWU, who's going to speak to you today and kick off by sharing some recent modifications to the ADMC program. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'll soon be joined by Dr. Mary Scolay, who's our Chief of Science, and as many of you know her and her expertise in this industry. The first town hall, we were very encouraged by the questions that we received and continued to receive after that town hall. So very supportive of conducting this again and have an opportunity to address any new questions that have come up as we continue to progress and evolve in this program. And as Lisa said, very excited to now nearly be at the 6-month mark for this program. Personally, I hope to be at a point in time where it doesn't take a town hall for questions to be coming in, and we're always open and receptive for many of these questions at really any time, and those can always be asked to those staff members that are in charge of communications and engagement within the industry. First, before we start taking questions and answering questions that have already been submitted through Lisa, we would like to start with a few slides to update attendees on some of the relevant changes with enforcement guidance that have already happened through the first 6 months, as well as highlight a couple significant proposed rules changes that are affecting ongoing cases within the program. So hopefully you can see the screen and we'll get started with these updates. So if you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the first topic that I did want to touch on again, as this is always a topic of conversation amongst many, but we did make some significant enforcement changes to the way provisional suspensions work and are imposed to covered persons. And that is primarily around the delay or the postponement of those provisional suspensions until a B sample does confirm an A sample analysis. And that is for many of the banned substances out there, which includes common human substances of abuse that are found on the backside of the track, such as cocaine, methamphetamine, MDMA, and THC, among another list of those substances. Most importantly, when that provisional suspension is postponed, that also means that it is not publicly disclosed on our website that is a pending violation. So that covered person does now have a chance to begin investigating the source of that potential violation. Again, those are not made public until the provisional suspension is imposed, which would either be the B sample being confirmed, or if the B sample is waived by the covered person. Additionally, there was an expansion of some permitted activities for covered persons while under provisional suspension. That includes the permission to engage in the caring for and jogging, galloping of their covered horses. This is obviously a horse welfare issue to make sure that horses are still able to be cared for on the backside. And then depending on the applicable track or state racing commission, permission to go to the front or the backside of those racetracks during the provisional suspension, that still lies with those tracks or the racing commissions. Additionally, permission to maintain ownership interest in a covered horse without affecting its eligibility to race if that person is provisionally suspended is an owner. So those are some key changes to the provisional suspensions. Next slide, please. I will turn it over to Dr. Scolay to go through these updates.
Sure. The first thing that we'd like to talk about is how we harmonize the limit of detection for metformin, because that sort of represents a pattern going forward. As we've discussed before, we've got a core group of analytes, 300 and some odd analytes for which we have laboratory specifications, and all of the labs have agreed to conform to those. Our banned substances list is far larger than that list of 300, and so as a new substance is identified, we need to go through the exercise of determining what all the different laboratories' capabilities are, what science is out there regarding that particular substance, and harmonize our analytical approach going forward, which is what we did with metformin. And it's important to realize that the lack of harmonization across the laboratories has existed for decades, and we are in the process of solving that problem. It's going to be solved one analyte at a time. It will be an ongoing work in progress, but for metformin, the laboratories now have harmonized testing specifications, and the labs will respond consistently regardless of where a sample is submitted, and metformin is present in that sample. So I think that challenging times, because there are an awful lot of substances out there that we need to sort through, and we won't sort through them until they're actually identified by a laboratory. But we are committed to harmonizing across the laboratories in fairness to stakeholders. The next step is some clarification concerning the use of electrolytes. The following may be administered up to 24 hours prior to a race or vet's list work. Electrolytes can be administered to a horse by top dressing on the feed, like the granules, or by oral administration, which is either paste or a drench. And unsupplemented isotonic fluids, such as lactated ringers, can be administered intravenously up to 24 hours. Additional controls on electrolyte administration: they can be administered via nasogastric tube up to 48 hours prior to a race or vet's list work. The use of the stomach tube, as a rule, will be prohibited inside of 48 hours, regardless of the substance being administered through the tube. Salt and mineral blocks can be made available to horses at any time, 24/7, and the same with unsupplemented isotonic electrolyte solutions that are consumed by free choice. Again, that's hanging a bucket of plain water and a bucket of electrolyte water, and the horse gets to choose what he wants to consume. That can be made available to horses at any time. Back to Ben.
Thank you. And lastly, I wanted to highlight a few pending rules changes that have been submitted to the FTC in regards to the 2024 rules, specifically because these do impact some pending cases out there that are publicly known on our website. The first is the recategorization of several substances, but which includes altrenogens. The other would be in certain circumstances, an imposition of less severe sanctions for positive tests with human substances of abuse. So you can find the exact language for both of those on the HISA website and on the FTC website when those are formally added to their website. But what's important is to know that those pending cases that have solo cases involving positive tests for altrinogens and methamphetamine. Currently, those cases have been stayed and the provisional suspensions have been lifted pending the FTC approval of those rules. And with that, we will turn it back over to Lisa and begin questions.
Thank you, Ben and Mary. That was a very helpful update. So we want to spend the majority of the time here with you today answering your questions directly. Many of you already submitted questions, so we're going to start with those. But if you have questions you did not submit in advance, please feel free to click on the Q&A toolbar and select Submit a Question, and we will try to get to all of those ADMC-related questions during the course of this webinar. So starting with the ones that are already submitted, but if you want to submit one now, you have the ability to do so. All right, so starting with the very first question we received, why did USADA decline to work for the thoroughbred racing industry in America? So under the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act, the HISA authority was required to select an anti-doping agency to be independent. The philosophy behind that, as I understand it, was that they wanted a clear separation between the entity HISA that's making the rules and the entity that's actually enforcing them, so that we had, you know, true integrity and separation. And so we went through a process of trying to determine which agency, which entity would be the best for the thoroughbred industry and for our goals and our mission. And ultimately, we decided, based on a number of factors, including expertise, cost, philosophy, that it made the most sense to create a bespoke agency, which is the Horse Racing Integrity and Welfare Unit, and to appoint Drug Free Sport International based on their extensive experience in other professional sports to essentially be the entity that runs HIWU. And so that is the answer to that question. Second question is, has HIWU detected any substances not previously reported by racing commissions? So I will hand over to Ben to answer that question.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. You know, that's a tough question to definitively answer as a yes or no, given the reporting structure previously before HISA and HIWU. What we do know is that now, for the first time, you know, there is a central authority where testing is being applied the same across all jurisdictions, and with full transparency on what is being reported. You know, to the best of my knowledge, I believe there are at least one or more substances that have not been reported in quite some time, at least, if you were to dig back through old records. So, and that would include dispropylamine for one example. So, but it is a different approach now.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is somewhat related. Is the positive rate significantly different than previously reported by racing commissions? Ben, if you can take that one also. Yeah,
again, a bit comparing apples to oranges in a way of how the reporting structure was done previously. You know, in a lot of ways where annual reports were completed and compiled amongst the racing commissions, it included reporting amongst all the breeds. Obviously, HIWU and HISA only have jurisdiction over thoroughbred racing and not standardbred or quarter horse. So the data in previous years was voluntary, as I understand it, but also included those other breeds. You know, in regards to the actual positivity rate that was reported before, they seem to be comparable in relation to total positivity. But one substantial difference from a HIWU standpoint is the percentage of positives in regards to banned substances, where over 30% of our substances that we've reported on have been for banned substances.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, can you explain the procedures to have an attorney appointed for your defense if you have insufficient funds to pay for an attorney yourself? That's an excellent question, but I think I'm going to back it up to explain maybe from the beginning the different resources that are available to covered persons. To start, as soon as a covered person receives a notification letter that they're alleged to have violated the anti-doping rules, which is typically a positive test being returned from one of our labs, they will get the opportunity at that point in time to first contact the ombudsman, Alan Foreman, and they'll be given information about how to contact him, phone number, email, etc. And Alan's role is really to help explain to any covered persons essentially what the process is, what they need to do next, how to best protect themselves, basically anything at all that they want to know or understand about the process, so they don't feel confused or without the proper resources to manage. After that, if they want a B sample and they don't have the funds to pay for the cost of a B sample, they can make that claim, and through a process with HIWU, if they don't have the funds for a B sample, that will be paid for them. I think the point is that we want any trainer, owner, covered person to have a full opportunity to present their defense, to have due process. The philosophy behind the program is to have all of the information so we can make good decisions. And so we have a program that protects the industry. And to have a good program, you need to be able to give people the resources to tell their story, to provide their explanations. So that's one part of it. And then the second part is we now have, and we've been working on this for a while, but I'm pleased to say that it's finally now come to fruition, is that we now have a pro bono panel of lawyers, which essentially means that we have lawyers from reputable law firms who have agreed to provide services at no cost, so long as the covered person qualifies financially for those services. So we have a private process where if in fact you want to seek representation from the pro bono panel, that you would go through Alan Foreman to make that request, or you could also make it directly to HIWU. You'll be asked a few questions about your earnings, and then if you qualify, you will in fact be given the full support of pro bono counsel, which, and all of these pro bono counsel have gone through a training program so that they understand and know the rules and are equipped to support you. So I'm really pleased that we have that now because, as I said, nobody wants it to be a situation where somebody is charged with a violation and they don't have the resources to properly defend themselves. Okay, I'm going on to the next question. Before I do that, I want to remind everyone that if you have a question that you have not submitted in advance, please click on me, submit my questions on the side and write your question, and it will magically come to me and I will ask it. Okay, next question is HIWU considering evolving testing beyond immunoassay and mass spec toward more biological passport type testing to what USADA does with human athletes using its hematologic and hormone passport testing? I think that was probably a medical person. A lot of big words there. Mary, can you please answer that one?
Sounds like it's my question, yes. First off, I'd say that immunoassay use is quite limited as it stands right now, and it is only used for screening. The labs are required to produce an unequivocal identification when they report a finding, and that to this point really involves mass spectrometry. Biological passport testing is under investigation by highly skilled researchers domestically and internationally, and it does have potential relevance in the future. Right now, it's not there. It's not ready for prime time for a number of reasons. One, that it requires multiple samplings of each individual horse to determine that horse's own patterns. There's a pilot project underway in France right now, and they had ambitiously wanted to pursue a larger number of horses. They've drilled down to somewhere between 10 and 25 right now following them, and it's costing upwards of $100,000 per year to monitor that limited number of horses. Additionally, biologic passports identify signs of a horse having been manipulated as opposed to actually identifying the foreign substance present in the horse's sample. So I think we also have to work closely with the attorneys as we contemplate how this information could be used in identifying a violation and prosecuting a case. So just to be clear, it took WADA almost 15 years from the concept until they were prepared to implement their their biologic passport program. And so we've got good people working on it, but it's going to be a while before it becomes an enforcement tool. It may be an investigative tool prior to that. We'll see what we can learn and how it can help us improve safety and integrity.
Thank you, Mary. The next question is, what is being done to bring interested parties together to raise questions and offer alternative solutions that may work? Is there a process where thoughtful suggestions can be made and discussed in a curious manner? So first of all, the short answer is absolutely yes. This is probably a good opportunity to just explain a little bit the structure of HISA and the different sort of organizations and groups that are available to receive feedback and engage. I just want to say to start that on behalf of both HISA and HIWU, we very much welcome suggestions. We welcome interaction from the industry. Many suggestions over the course of time we've actually implemented, and you can tell that from the introduction that Ben gave, which all of those suggestions, frankly, came from the industry and from industry comment. So it really is important that you all engage with us. We have something significant to discuss or bring to our attention, because that's the best way for us to get, salient information. We obviously have resources and people on our teams who are, have deep histories in racing, but nonetheless, it's always helpful to hear directly from people. And you can do that by, feedback at hisaus.org. You can, it's, info for at hiwu.org. But also if you go to our websites, you'll see, particularly for HISA, staff members that probably many of you know and recognize and have worked with over the years, like Jennifer Dernberger and Mark Guilfoyle and Anne McGovern, and you can also, reach out to them directly. But just to maybe do full circle on that, HISA has a 9-member board that was appointed by Congress, actually, through a nominating committee. And then below the board, there are 2 standing committees, one for racetrack safety and one for ADMC. They both are 7-member committees, and they are actually the committees that make the rules. I don't make the rules. My HISA doesn't make the rules. We enforce the rules. We are, though, the vehicle through which industry feedback or concerns are often presented to those committees, who ultimately are charged with making the rules. In particular, the Horsemen's Advisory Group that's consists of a number of trainers, owners, veterinarians, that entity, when they have a suggestion that they'd like to make for incorporation in the rules, it typically either comes through the HISA staff, or we'll ask members of the Horsemen's Advisory Group to come and present to one of the standing committees. So that is sort of the vehicle through which we get information, but we always welcome it, and you can really reach us through many different, I think, vehicles and groups, frankly. Okay, moving on. Are we advancing the ability to detect PED use? For example, are we further along in being able to detect drugs that trainers, owners are using as undetectable? That definitely sounds like a Mary question.
And I think the answer is absolutely yes. It's been heartwarming and reassuring to see the level of engagement from stakeholders in providing us with information, submitting materials, products that have been provided to them or made available to them for us to analyze at the laboratories, determine what's in them. And then the next step is to figure out, once that's in a horse, what does it look like? Does it look like the same thing that was put in the horse, or does it look different? And then when it comes out of the horse, looking at the matrices that we test, blood and urine, what does that substance look like in those matrices? So the answer is yes, we're working very hard. We've gotten good intelligence and tremendous cooperation across the laboratories in terms of sharing intelligence and sharing information. So I definitely think we're headed in the right direction here.
Thank you, Mary. And I think the next one also has your name on it. The question is, will thresholds of relevant medications be made available to any parties outside of HIWU? It would be of interest to compare these to previous policies and/or regulations in place for other breeds.
Okay, so first of all, words matter. The only things we have thresholds for are endogenous substances like testosterone. We have screening limits for other therapeutic medications, and the list for which we have screening limits is largely consistent with the ARCI's controlled therapeutic substance schedule. So we are not providing less information with regards to therapeutic medications than previously existed. I can't speak for the authority or regulations that could be filed with respect to additional medications. But right now, I would certainly say that the amount of information available for making determinations about the use of therapeutic medications is consistent with the volume of information that was previously available prior to the ADMC program.
Thank you. And I'm sorry to say, Mary, that you're going to be up again. Has practical science been used to devise your mandates rules? Could you explain the thought process behind picogram level testing and how a picogram would affect performance?
Sure. I get up on my soapbox here. And first of all, I'm not sure what impractical science would be. I think that, yes, science has definitely been used to formulate the controls on the therapeutic medications. Those that came from the IFHA were developed by a process where the irrelevant plasma or urine concentration is calculated based on the results of pharmacokinetic studies. It's all very sciencey. And so
maybe you could explain what the IFHA is. I'm not sure everybody on this.
Sure. Apologies. IFHA is the International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities, and the Act, the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act, requires that HISA comport with the controls on therapeutic medications and anti-doping strategies of the IFHA. Okay. Okay. Can you explain the thought process behind picogram level testing? Yes, I can. You need to remember that picograms are simply a measurement of weight. A picogram doesn't tell you about the potency of a substance. It just tells you how much of it you have there in terms of weight. A pound of Swiss chocolate weighs the same as a pound of broccoli. And I would much rather eat the chocolate than the broccoli, right? There are large differences in the calories, in vitamin content. I mean, there are virtually no similarities between Swiss chocolate and broccoli. I would not give you broccoli for dessert, I promise, okay? So picograms are simply measurements of weight, and for some substances, they are highly relevant. Substances that are administered in low milligram doses are readily measured at picogram concentrations in the blood when they are at their highest concentration. On the other hand, we have some other substances that are administered in gram doses. Phenylbutasone is given 2 grams to a single horse in a single dose. And so picogram concentrations of phenylbutazone are not relevant, and that's why we don't control bute in picogram concentrations. And that's why we don't have a single value for blood and urine that spans all the substances. They're all different, and they all require separate consideration based on what is known about them scientifically. And so that's what I've got to say about that.
Thank you. The next question is, how long until the FTC reviews and votes on the proposed red line changes? I wish I knew. We unfortunately don't control the FTC's timeline, but we'll keep the industry updated as we get updates from them or as we have more information. But in the meantime, the existing rules remain in place. But I do want to make a comment about that, which is that if you remember Ben's presentation from the very beginning of this webinar, he explained that in order to give covered persons the benefit of potential changes, assuming the FTC does approve our proposal for the new rules, they have essentially stayed, which means frozen the cases and lifted the frozen suspensions of those covered persons that would be favorably impacted by the new rules. So, you know, it could easily have been, and it would be sensible, or in a lot of regulatory jurisdictions, the answer would just be, listen, you were subject to the rules that were in place at the time. But we took the position that, and there is some rule, there is a rule in our overall, in the anti-doping rules that gives us the ability to use more relaxed, more beneficial rules if they come into effect later to the benefit of covered persons. So we've gone ahead and done that. And that's why those cases have been frozen, but we don't know exactly when the FTC will actually approve our rules. Great. I'm now going to go to, actually, no, I have one more question. Sorry. Before the ADMC program took effect, HISA and HIWU were trumpeting the atypical findings policy, and that would protect trainers from being crucified for contamination. But I haven't heard of this policy being applied at all. What's the point of this supposed protection if no one benefits from it? Ben, can you answer that one?
I can. So the atypical findings policy, a couple points on that. Number one, the atypical findings policy is meant to protect the covered person in regards to public disclosure of that going on. So when we receive a finding for one of the 26 specified substances under the atypical findings policy, we immediately do an investigation in collaboration with the interested parties. So that's the covered person, the Racing Commission, and maybe others, HISA as needed. But it does not trigger in any way an adverse finding, meaning that the potential violation is made public in any way. It truly is an investigation into those substances. Those substances are on that atypical findings list because they are commonly found for environmental contamination. So as a reminder, those are typically substances arising from plants, traditionally grazed, harvested as equine feed. They pose a higher risk of being present in feed due to contamination during cultivation, processing, storage, or transportation. That is the true definition of environmental contamination. So the policy is working. We actually have 26 separate cases involving these substances that are not posted publicly and not disclosed. Of those 26, 15 of those cases have been resolved already. 14 of those 15 were dismissed as a negative. One was pursued as an adverse finding. And the other pending cases are still under investigation. So that policy is working very well. We will disclose additional data around the atypical findings policy on an annual basis, which will be reported in our annual report in Q1 of 24.
Great. Thank you, Ben. I think maybe just to add on to that, Ben, I know there's often a lot of questions and talk around the difference between environmental contamination and the inadvertent transfer of human medications. Ben explained at the beginning some of the changes that we've made to those enforcement policies. I think it's also important for people to realize, HIWU has tested 42,000 horses approximately at this point in time. They've had 11 positives for human drugs of abuse. So I know a lot of people are frightened that it may happen or it's easy to happen, but you have to realize that's 0.26 of a percent. It's a very, very small number. We still have to deal with them responsibly and fairly. And that's why we have some of these new rules to make sure that we can actually do that properly. But it is a very, very small number of samples that are analyzed. I have one more question before I move on to the questions submitted today. What can HISA and HIWU do to educate the public about the differences between doping and medications that are allowed in horses? I think that's a great question. During the creation of the anti-doping rules, there was a lot of conversation around the distinction between truly doping substances and medications, things that are absolutely fine to use on a horse, but just between races and not on race day. So when we set out to kind of finalize these rules, we took great efforts to make that separation very clear. There's controlled medications and there are banned substances, and the banned substances are the doping substances and the medications, obviously the therapeutics. And I think if you look at, the HIWU website, there's a very clear distinction between both categories. And if you also sort of follow the media, et cetera, I believe that's been reflected in coverage, and that there's been very little coverage of medication violations and very little, if not zero, association of those violations with actual doping. And I really think that's a very important step forward, because we need to continue to educate the public and obviously sort of non-trade media on those differences, because they are meaningful, and it's something that we're dedicated to really explaining and making sure the public understands. Okay, so moving on to now the questions that I'm receiving live. Before HISA HIWU, if a trainer was suspended due to a violation, that suspension was honored by all other racing jurisdictions in the US. Now a trainer suspended by HISA could be free to race in states not under HISA's jurisdiction. How are you going to fix this? That's a great question. Obviously under the ARCI, there used to be, I think, a full faith and credit and a respect across state lines. Currently, there are a number of states that are not under HISA's jurisdiction. West Virginia and Louisiana are subject to an injunction, which will be resolved at some point in time. And other states have chosen not to broadcast their signal. So HISA does not have any authority to do anything about that. However, I do think that if constituents, covered persons, stakeholders communicate with other jurisdictions about the importance of honoring violations in all states where racing is taking place, certainly racing that's being simulcast, that would be a positive step forward for the industry. I do understand the concern, but at this point in time, it's outside of HISA's control. What is the number of horses tested since HIWU took over versus the number of horses tested before? Ben, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can easily answer number of horses tested. I mean, we're over 42,000 horses tested. And as Lisa said, we'll be at the 6-month mark next week. So that is easy to respond to versus the number of horses tested before at a given 6-month time frame. I'm not really sure what would have been tested. I can tell you with conversations amongst racing commissions, it seems that for the most part, total horses being tested are pretty comparable. From a post-race standpoint, we test anywhere between, say, 1.5 to 2 horses per race out there. But what we're really focusing on strategically is an increase in out-of-competition testing. And Mary, you went off mute, so you must have something else to add to that.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the out-of-competition piece is huge and maybe overlooked by some, because they just look at the number of horses going to the test barn after a race. But clearly there were states that weren't performing out-of-competition testing. They represented havens for those who wanted to potentially evade the rules. There were other states that said they were doing out-of-competition testing and they were sampling horses on their way to the paddock for a stakes race. And so I think that, we can say with confidence that our program represents an equitable program across all of the jurisdictions under HISA's authority. Nobody is able to evade out-of-competition testing, and I think I think that's very important.
Thank you, Mary. I only have 2 questions left. So if you want to ask a question, now is the time, because once I get through these last 2 questions, we will just quickly summarize and end the webinar. Okay, the next question. There was a percentage given for identifying 30+ banned substances. Is it not important to recognize that many substances are now identified as banned, were not previously, like Regumate and Thyro-L? So I'll start and then I'll pass over to Ben and Mary. Yes, of course, that's really important. And I know that Mary, went on a very long cross-country tour to try to make sure that, all trainers and et cetera were educated about the new rules. We have, I think it's almost like 50+ educational materials on the HIWU website. We are available all the time for questions and answers. And then one other thing that I just want to mention is that with regards to Regumate, Regumate is obviously Altrenagest. Maybe I shouldn't say obviously. Altrenagest is Regumate. Regumate, I believe, is the trade commercial name. So just to be aware that the new rules do move Regumate from being banned to a controlled medication, which is why the Altrenagest or Regumate cases were stayed. So I don't know, Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it, Mary.
No. Okay, well then I'm going to head to the last question. Does HISA use the IFHA rules as a guideline? So I'll start and then I'll hand over to Mary. So as Mary said earlier, the IFHA is the International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities. So basically all of the governing bodies for thoroughbred horse racing in the world get together and discuss, common rules and policies, et cetera, and to the extent how to better align to be one horse racing industry. The Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act requires us to use the IFHA guidelines, screening limits, rules as a starting point. But if we feel that the unique nature of American racing or something else that's important so mitigates that we should actually diverge or be slightly different, we can do that with the consent of the ADMC committee and HIWU. So there are places where we have sort of done something different from the IFHA. One example is Butte. There's a much longer withdrawal time. I think it's 96 hours internationally than we have here in the US. So we have that opportunity, but we have to actually go through a process to diverge from the IFHA under the Act. That's not a HISA rule. That's what the law itself requires us to do. Do you want to add anything to that, Mary?
No, just that really justification is required to deviate from the IFHA. And the ADMC did that with the anti-ulcer medications. The international community is not permissive of them within 48 hours of a race. There is science that suggests that is not in the best interest of horse welfare. The ADMC recognized that and agreed to be permissive of anti-ulcer medications to protect horse health up to 24 hours prior to a race. And if you've got a horse who needs to be maintained on them for gastrointestinal health, you can give your anti-ulcer medication 24 hours prior to the race and then give it to that horse after it gets back to the barn, after it's run and it's cooled out. So, the ADMC has been very thoughtful in considering horse health as they look at the regulations and decide if modifications are warranted.
Thank you. Okay, one more question just in. What is the relationship between HISA and HIWU and the previous interstate compact? So if I understand that correctly, the difference between HISA and the previous interstate compact is that the compact was obviously voluntary. And so it didn't necessarily work because not every state would agree to join or would agree to follow the same rules. HISA is obviously a federal law, and because of that, it's not voluntary, it's mandatory. Once HISA has and promulgates a rule, it's mandatory that all of the HISA jurisdictions, follow that rule. I think I explained earlier that the Act also requires an independence for the anti-doping authority. In most governing bodies in other sports, you would see the body that's responsible for safety and integrity also be the one that administers the ADMC program. But the way that Congress wanted us to run it, I believe to ensure, true integrity and transparency and separation, was they required that we appoint a separate anti-doping agency, and they would run the day-to-day processes of the program. And that's, what HIWU's role is currently. No, Ben, if you want to add anything to that.
Nope, you answered that very well. Thank you.
60 Minutes, so I'm going to have two more questions. 60 Minutes reported the positive test for beta-methazone from Medina Spirit in the Kentucky Derby as a banned substance. How would you recommend the media accurately report this? Yes, obviously, I think that is misguided information. It was under a previous, regulatory body. HISA was not in charge when the Medina Spirit tested positive. So I can't speak to Kentucky and the Kentucky processes, but certainly under HISA, beta-methazone is a medication. It would not be called a banned substance, and it would be treated differently than the banned or doping substances. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that.
Well, I think that,
sorry, just one more thing. I think the recommendation is that we educate the media as much as we can. And, we've done this with a lot of our big events, like with NBC, for example, who's been fantastic, is, we take the time to explain the rules, explain the processes, and typically the media is really receptive to that. So we just need to put the time in. Unfortunately, even notwithstanding my 2 hours with 60 Minutes, telling them all the positive things about racing and all the reforms and talking about trainers that are doing things right, they didn't choose to report any of that because, you know, they had a particular story they were going for. But I think what's important is that we educate the media where we can. Mary?
I was just going to say, and educate our stakeholders as well. As I said earlier, language matters. And right now we have 3 words that are very important. There's prohibited, and then there's banned and controlled. And banned and controlled are both subsets of prohibited substances. So 3 words. And as we talk about substances, we try to be very specific about whether they are banned or controlled. And we, encourage the regulatory veterinarians, the people in the test barn, everybody to be very mindful of the language that we use so that, again, we're all speaking the same language, and then that gets transferred to anybody who is outside the game.
And I would add in relation to the media that both HISA and HIWU have very experienced communications personnel, always in contact with the media, not only just to answer questions, but also to monitor the information that goes out to the public. And I can count numerous times where we have corrected information in articles by the media.
When a trainer has been found, last question, when a trainer has been found with an old medication container, but no horses have tested positive for that drug, why is it necessary to give lengthy suspensions, especially when there's no history of violations? Do you want to start with that one, Mary, and I can follow up?
Sure. If the container contains a banned substance, the regulations are very clear. Possession of a banned substance is an anti-doping violation. We spend an awful lot of time interacting with stakeholders in advance of the rollout of the regulations to make sure people were clear on that. Everybody was admonished to do a spring cleaning in their tack room for that very reason, because there were substances whose status had substantially changed with the implementation of the ADMC rules. Things that lack FDA approval that should otherwise have it are banned substances, and that is intended to protect the horsemen from substances that are adulterated, that are manufactured under substandard conditions. We've had several substances that have been analyzed by laboratories and determined to have present substances that were not included on their list of ingredients, one of which was actually a banned substance. So there's a reason that the regulations support the use of FDA-approved medications, and it's the rule.
And if I can,
yeah, you go, Ben. I also have something to add, but you go first.
Testing is just one piece of this program. And we can't financially or realistically test every horse every day. And just because you may not have a presence violation for a specific substance doesn't automatically mean that that wasn't being used at some point in time. A perfect example is Lance Armstrong. He never tested positive. He never had a presence violation, but yet he was found to be doping for many, many years and was able to evade the testing being conducted on him. So as Mary said, just possession of that banned substance is very clear in the rules as a violation.
There's one more thing I'd like to add to that, just about the process, because I'm not sure this is really clear to everyone. So if you're charged with a possession violation, you have the opportunity automatically, without doing anything more, to get a 6-month reduction on the sanction just by accepting the consequences. But even further than that, if you want to engage with HIWU and provide an explanation and have a settlement conversation, it can actually often be a lot more than that, and the sanction could be a lot lower. But once the covered person, who has every right to do this, decides to go in front of an arbitrator, we lose control, because then it's up to the private judge, the arbitrator, to decide the consequences. So once it goes into that form, it's like going to court. It's a private court, it's an arbitrator, but it's ultimately then up to this independent arbitrator to make a decision. And we at HISA or HIWU no longer have the opportunity to reach any kind of resolution. It's really out of our hands at that point in time. And so some of the extreme sanctions that you've seen have come from arbitrators who, after evaluating all of the evidence and hearing from the covered persons, chose to implement those sanctions. But that is like, you know, the sort of last step in the process. And there are opportunities much earlier to resolve and engage. And that's also why we have Alan Foreman, and now we also have this pro bono panel so that everybody can have representation.
And, you know, we understand that there are substances out there that may be medically prescribed to a non-covered horse and need to be kept close by for that horse. But, you know, it's the responsibility of that covered person to make sure that those substances are properly maintained, properly stored, that they are prescribed according, you know, to the accurate horse that it's meant to be prescribed to. You know, there's a lot of things that those individuals can do to protect themselves and make sure that those are, you know, can be easily explained.
Great. Well, I think we are at time now, and I think if there are no more questions coming in, I really just want to thank everyone so much for being here today and giving us the chance to communicate the information that we have and to engage and to send in questions. That really is appreciated. It doesn't have to end here. You can email us at any point in time, feedback@hisaus.org or info@hiwu.org, and we will get back to you. We'll answer your questions. Again, just want to remind anyone, if you have a suggested topic for a future webinar, please do let us know. But with that, I just want to say again, on behalf of Ben and Mary and I, thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving. We wish everyone the best and look forward to seeing all of you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.